John's great mission for his gospel appears to be twofold. On the one hand, John aims to present Jesus as a universal, salvific figure congenial to both educated Jews and Gentiles. And on the other hand, John looks to compete with rival traditions which threaten his message and community. John's method for accomplishing these goals is this: to construct an evangelistic, narratival polemic for a mixed audience, which will both confront the various claims of his opponents about the Messiah and offer the Jewish Christian versions of Hellenistic fashions. Granting this mission, the format of the narratival polemic reveals itself as a powerful method. John is able to summon Jesus to defend himself against a range of challengers, to correct the record in the face of Christological speculation, and ultimately to present a Jewish Christianity which can stand on its own in a widening Hellenistic world. The Gospel of John as an evangelistic, multi-front polemic. In reality, my solution is one which draws and combines the best elements from previous observations. First, I take the essential Palestinian Jewish background for John proposed by most modern scholars, but I combine it with one side of the view of E.F. Scott, that John also features a restatement of the Christian message in Hellenistic terms, and that it is a layered polemic against Jews, the Baptist sect, and Gnostic influences. The arguments against the Gnostics and the arguments against the Jews stand side by side as two arms of John's mission to present a Jesus and a Jewish Christian faith congenial to both Jew and Gentile. I also accept J.L. Martin's basic proposal that John features a two-level history in which Jesus' confrontations with Jewish leaders reflects John's community conflict, and I apply that elemental principle in some places to reveal another Johannine conflict with Gnosticism. I finally overlay the biblical Unitarian interpretation of John's Christology, as in H. Vent, and more recently in Buzzard and Tuggy. This ultimately yields a gospel which has no trouble standing as an evangelistic polemic working against both Jewish objections and Gnostic ideas, and one which seeks to establish John's unique brand of Judaism in the Hellenistic world. E.F. Scott, Bultmann, and others who embarked upon similar considerations as my own saw John as a gospel of antimony, both Gnostic and anti-Gnostic. Scott had resolved this inconsistency, however, by claiming that John was not in any true sense a Gnostic, but had only adapted common philosophical ideas of his time. As Scott rightly pointed out, quote, "We must distinguish between the essence of John's thought from the forms in which he embodied it." End quote. However, it has often been thought that John's parallels with Gnostic thought are accidental. John was simply working from the same background of ideas which later contributed to the formation of Gnostic sects. But I believe the parallels are much more careful and deliberate than this. I affirm Scott and others' recognition of only a superficial resemblance between John and Gnostic thought, but this resemblance is not accidental. John is presenting the Jewish Christian versions of those trends in order to both compete and evangelize. As G.W. McRae once recommended, quote, "The evangelist is not merely influenced by a complex and syncretistic religious background, but deliberately makes use of such a background for his interpretation of Jesus." End quote. And as Scott fleetingly suggested, quote, "It is not improbable that John was influenced also by a practical motive, that of regaining for the Orthodox faith the more speculative minds which were gradually drifting apart from it. He may well have judged that mere antagonism to the prevailing error served little purpose. What was needed was such a widening and deepening of the common faith that all the varieties of religious temperament might find their home within the Church of Christ." End quote. Thus, we might say that John utilizes a Gnostic framework for his Jewish Christian doctrine in order to draw disciples away from Gnostic circles and towards his own religion. Indeed, Scott did recognize that John shared in 1 John's antagonism with the new Gnostic movement, and that the gospel ultimately stands for the historical tradition of Jesus against a vague idealism, giving prominence to, quote, the ethical demands of Christianity, end quote. In my view, however, John is indeed concerned with the historical Jesus and with ethics over ideals. But Scott and others have failed to properly translate these concerns to the Gospel's discourses and ultimately to the Gospel's Christology, an exercise which, I believe, yields only an unqualified human Christology. Despite potential objections to my theory, which I will address soon, I believe it is possible to locate in John a unified and coherent front against a developing Gnostic world, specifically against Gnostic interpretations of Jesus, humanity, and human salvation. In this view, John's Gospel dwells not in the simultaneously docetic and anti-docetic tension of many Trinitarian readings. But neither does John live in a world as narrowly focused and as insulated from Gnosticism as some of Bultmann's critics might suggest. Rather, the fourth Gospel is one which is positively Jewish Christian and dependent on wisdom tradition, but one that is also intimately aware of gnosis and sallies forth to meet it on its own terms. But recognizing a John that is truly Jewish, as well as anti-Gnostic, will prove difficult, as long as Orthodox readings of John's Christology are allowed to color the view. Analyzing John as a polemic in light of the biblical Unitarian interpretation will lend us much-needed clarity in the untangling of Jewish and Gnostic thought in John, and valuable insight into not only what John does mean, but just as importantly, what he does not mean. Only the biblical Unitarian reading is capable of offering this degree of visibility, because many of the ideas which John specifically sets itself against happen to show a surprising affinity to much of what is considered Orthodox theology. Little work has been done heretofore in analyzing how John's relationship with Gnosticism could actually support John's Jewish background and ultimately a Jewish Christian portrait of Jesus. If it can be granted for a moment that John's Jesus is the same human Jesus of the Synoptics, cast in a different light for polemical and evangelistic reasons, the fog surrounding both John's relationship with Gnosis and its own Christology will begin to rapidly dissipate. John's audience. Scholars have often painted the fourth Gospel as being either addressed to the Church or addressed to non-Christians. But, as A. Wind argues, this is a false dilemma which must be dropped. Scholars have likewise pointed to either an ethnically Jewish or Gentile audience. But again, this is another dilemma which should be abandoned. In my view, the Gospel's audience is a mixed audience of Jew and Gentile. The Gospel was probably published in Ephesus, and there it was to be read publicly, and eventually copied for dissemination in a Hellenistic environment. The primary reading audience was probably the Johannine community itself, but the Gospel's evangelistic qualities prove it was also intended to be read by non-Christians. See John 20:31. The Johannine community was a Jewish diaspora community, but one with a Gentile element. What percentage of the community was Gentile is impossible to know, but I suggest the membership was mostly Jewish. The Gospel's concerns with the synagogue, the destruction of the temple and its replacement with Jesus, and its deep relationship with Jewish thought, particularly Jewish thought as found in the Septuagint, would resonate best with a Jewish diaspora audience. But John's presentation of its unique Jewish Christian teaching in Hellenistic forms, including its affinity to Hellenistic philosophical dialogues and its willingness to draw near to Gnostic ways of thinking, would resonate with both Hellenized or even Gnosticizing Jews, as well as Gentiles either already associated with or still outside of John's community. Here we may locate yet another affinity between the fourth Gospel and trends in Hellenism, which will help to establish its setting and intentions: internationalization. Peter Borgen explains that, quote, "It can be seen in John's broadening of ethnic Jewish concepts into cosmic concepts. John's Gospel reflects a situation in which the Johannine community had moved beyond the ethnic Jewish boundaries into the broader world of other nations, as indicated by John's use of the terms the Samaritans and the Greeks. It may even be said that the cosmic broadening of ethnic ideas in John corresponds to the cosmic broadening of the ideas of the city-state to the view that the whole cosmos is a city-state inhabited by gods and mortals. As the Johannine community moved beyond the ethnic Jewish boundaries, it understood its identity both in continuity with and in discontinuity with the Jewish people and their traditions. God's Son, as the commissioned agent, caused a division to take place within the Jewish people between recognition and belief, and recognition and disbelief, and this dual reaction represented what was to happen everywhere." End quote. How might this interact with Craig Keener's suggestion that the Johannine community was largely working to reclaim its Jewishness? Should we understand John as an effort to reunite Jewish Christians with the synagogue, or as an effort to broaden the community to include Jews, Greeks, and whoever else was willing to join them on the side of recognition and belief in Jesus as Messiah? In light of the deliberate internationalization in John, its evangelistic preaching intended to be published in a Hellenistic environment, and the conscious parallels it draws with popular Hellenistic, even Gnostic religious thinking, it seems best to view John as a gospel reflecting a Jewish Christianity looking to move beyond the confines of the synagogue, a choice made easier after their alleged involuntary expulsion, and beyond the ethnic boundaries of their exclusivist Jewish history. This is not to suggest that the community was willing to abandon or dilute its Jewish identity. Rather, for purposes of universal evangelism and probably survival, it welcomed the participation of the Hellenistic world in its Christian brand of Judaism. However, it sought only a participation within clearly defined boundaries. Those Hellenists who would join them on the side of recognition and belief in Jesus must be prepared to recognize the Jewish Jesus. It must be that Jesus of the apostolic preaching. Jesus as Messiah is King of the whole world, yes, but he is first the King of Israel, and the prophet like Moses, who must be accepted within the framework of Jewish monotheism. This standard must likewise be maintained by those already in the community, or they must be prepared to secede, as evidently some of them did. See 1st through 3rd John. Thus, John's work becomes that of evangelism as well as defense. As Wind recommends, quote, "It is therefore not improbable that the purpose of John's gospel is as broad as its universalistic character seems to suggest." End quote. We should be careful, with as cosmopolitan a community as John's, not to over-tighten the focus of his gospel towards either Judaism or Hellenism to the end that we lose too much sight of one or the other. In the early 20th century, Johannine commentators saw John almost exclusively in Hellenistic and Gnostic terms, and this has, in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls, proven insufficient. But as the current paradigm, in which little time is spent considering a Johannine relationship with Gnosticism, been an overcorrection, Schnackenberg cautioned against one-sidedness. Like myself, he saw the gospel as having a missional purpose, but did not exclude secondary motives, including polemics against the Baptists, apologetics against Jewish attacks, and even reactions against Gnostic views of Christ. For Schnackenberg, these could all move the gospel in the direction of both defending the faith and winning new converts. The present tendency to ignore or downplay Gnostic parallels in John in favor of exclusively Jewish ones appears to be an overreaction, and one possibly strengthened by a desire to segregate John from a sympathy with Gnostic ways of thinking which earlier commentators, and indeed many early Christians, detected. Nevertheless, the background of the fourth gospel proves to be both Jewish and Hellenistic, and so are the problems it addresses. The solutions John provides, however, are undeniably Jewish-Christian. The misunderstanding motif and the Gospel of John's polemic. Recognizing one Johannine technique will prove increasingly helpful in establishing the fourth gospel's polemic, and in better recognizing its targets: the misunderstanding motif. Misunderstanding Jesus is a major and pervasive theme in John's narrative. Jesus' audience misinterprets him in at least 15 out of the 21 chapters. Interestingly, in this light, we find that most of the Johannine passages which both Christian Gnostic readers of John and modern Trinitarians cite for Christological support are not only connected to this misunderstanding motif, but are often taken directly from the mouths of Jesus' mistaken opponents. In the course of this analysis, we will be led to wonder if John has taken some of the speculative Christological views of his late first-century rivals, retrojected them into the mouths of Jesus' historical adversaries, and cast those views as misunderstandings. On the other hand, it is just as plausible that John could have selected historical sayings of Jesus' enemies, which mirrored or paralleled what John's Gnostic opponents were teaching about Jesus, and cast them as misunderstandings. The Holy Spirit could have enabled John to recall these sayings and Jesus' responses, which the synoptics might have had little need of, to assist John in his community conflict. Regardless, here we might detect a multi-level history, pace Martin's hypothesis. John could utilize the misunderstanding motif in order to portray Jewish religious authorities, who were troubling John's community, as ignorant, foolish, and hard-headed, as well as to counteract erroneous, that is, Gnostic, Christological tendencies. Again, several of the most poignant episodes which Gnostic and Orthodox readers have pointed to as evidence of an ontological pre-existence of Christ are connected to this misunderstanding motif. Jesus' opponents believe he has claimed to have literally descended out of the sky like manna. They also believe he has claimed to be literally older than Abraham. These perceptions occur right alongside their other erroneous conclusions, like their misunderstanding that Jesus intends for them to literally eat his flesh and drink his blood, and so on. Recognizing the misunderstanding motif and its place within the Gospel of John as a polemical text will prove helpful in discerning the evangelist's targets. The questions of authorship and reliability. How might different views of the historicity of the fourth gospel interact with the proposal that John is a narratival polemic? Working from the standpoint of the gospel as history, as a document at the very least based on eyewitness accounts, John could, reflecting on the ministry of Jesus, select and then interpret those historical discourses of Christ best suited to assist him in his own social and theological conflicts. From the standpoint of the gospel as literary theology, John simply retrojects statements and concepts into the ministry of the historical Jesus. From the standpoint of the gospel as part history and part theology, as in the partition here event, for example, we might say that the historical outline or even the notes source of John was elaborated upon by members of the Johannine community to reflect contemporary issues. The basis of the discourses is historical, but their settings are not. Regardless of what conclusion one arrives at regarding the historicity of John, the proposal that John is a polemical gospel reacting to circumstances in the writer's environment remains viable. It should be said that determining John's historicity, or pursuing the intriguing question of authorship, are not the aims of this investigation. Just as questions about authorship have surprisingly little impact on historical reliability, neither do the tensions over authorship or historicity threaten significantly the viability of John as a polemical narrative. Though the nature of our inquiry naturally draws out questions of reliability and authorship, our goal is to consider the meaning of John's content and why the author or authors chose to include it in the way that he did, with only secondary concern for exactly by whom and by what means it was composed. In the end, my underlying position is that the Gospel of John is an account of the historical ministry and teachings of Jesus, which has been tuned to confront the circumstances which the Johannine community found itself in by the end of the 1st century CE. And this is, I believe, a basic proposal which has the potential for wide acceptance alongside a variety of positions on John's authorship and reliability. In the next entry, I will be explaining who the targets of John's polemic actually were, and we will consider some of the ways in which his gospel was composed to address the various issues they were presenting for his community.